In Episode 4, Master Confidentiality, Integrity, Availability, and Resiliency, we treat these ideas not as abstract textbook labels, but as daily operating principles for every decision you make around systems and data. Most security professionals have heard the phrase confidentiality, integrity, and availability, often shortened to CIA, so many times that it starts to sound like background noise rather than a practical guide. Here, the aim is to move it back to the foreground and add resiliency as a fourth dimension that reflects how modern systems must behave under real-world stress. When you internalize these principles as habits, they begin to shape your design conversations, your risk decisions, and even the questions you ask during reviews. The result is an approach where exam scenarios feel like extensions of patterns you already use every day. Confidentiality is usually the first principle people mention, and for good reason, because it frames how you protect information from unauthorized access and disclosure. In operational terms, confidentiality goals are often simple to state. Only the right people, processes, and systems should see certain data, and only for the right reasons at the right time. Threats show up as eavesdropping, credential theft, excessive privileges, poorly configured sharing, and careless reuse of data in logs or test environments. Controls that support confidentiality include access control models, strong authentication, encryption at rest and in transit, redaction, tokenization, and disciplined handling of secrets. When you think of confidentiality not just as keep it secret, but as a continuous discipline of limiting exposure, policy, design, and operations all line up in clearer ways. Integrity shifts the focus from who can see data to whether that data and those processes can be trusted to be accurate, complete, and uncorrupted. Integrity needs include making sure that transactions are not altered silently, that logs reflect what truly happened, and that critical configurations cannot be changed without traceable authorization. Assurance mechanisms range from cryptographic checksums and digital signatures to database constraints, version control histories, and approval workflows that capture who changed what and when. Verification practices bring these mechanisms to life by reviewing logs, reconciling records, sampling transactions, and validating that expected controls actually fire when something is out of bounds. When integrity is treated as a lived requirement rather than a slogan, your mindset becomes prove it instead of trust it, which is exactly the posture a strong assessor brings to their work. Availability, in contrast, is about whether systems and data are ready for legitimate use when needed, at the level of performance the business expects. Requirements here involve clear definitions of uptime, recovery time, and acceptable degradation under load or partial failure. Dependencies matter greatly because availability is often broken not by the main application itself, but by supporting services such as identity, networking, storage, or external providers that the business quietly relies on. Graceful degradation strategies acknowledge that perfection is unrealistic, so you design ways for systems to fail in controlled, predictable ways, perhaps limiting certain features while keeping critical functions alive. When you think of availability as a chain of promises and dependencies rather than a single statistic, you become much better at spotting where real risk resides. Resiliency extends availability by asking how systems behave when bad things actually happen, not just whether they can theoretically stay up. A resiliency mindset assumes that failures, attacks, misconfigurations, and unexpected spikes in demand are inevitable over time. Instead of aiming for brittle perfection, you design to anticipate failure, absorb shocks, adapt, and continue the mission in some form. This might involve deliberate chaos testing, diversity of components, decoupling of services, and clear playbooks for shifting load or operating in degraded modes. When resiliency is present, confidentiality, integrity, and availability are not fragile ideals, but qualities that can flex under stress without collapsing entirely. These principles become much more concrete when you apply them to routine authentication events that happen thousands or millions of times a day. Confidentiality shapes how credentials are stored, transmitted, and displayed, ensuring they are never exposed in plain text or logged in ways that an attacker could harvest. Integrity demands that authentication decisions are based on accurate, untampered inputs, and that session states cannot be hijacked or altered without detection. Availability reminds you that authentication must remain responsive and dependable, because a secure system that nobody can log into is effectively offline. Resiliency asks how the authentication service behaves during partial outages, attacks against identity providers, or sudden surges in traffic, and whether there are fallback modes that preserve security while keeping the business moving. Data storage and transmission flows provide another everyday canvas for these principles to act together as a coherent set. Confidentiality guides where and how data is encrypted, who can decrypt it, and how keys are managed and rotated over time. Integrity is present in controls such as checksums on stored files, message authentication codes on transmitted data, and reconciliation processes that verify that what was written is what is later read. Availability appears in redundancy, replication strategies, capacity planning, and careful design around maintenance windows and backup procedures. Resiliency shows up when you plan for storage node failures, network partitioning, or corrupted backups, and still have a way to reconstruct or recover essential information without exposing it to unnecessary risk. Preventive, detective, and corrective controls can all be mapped back to these principles in ways that reinforce one another rather than remaining conceptual silos. Preventative controls include the designs and configurations that aim to stop confidentiality, integrity, or availability failures before they occur, such as strong access models, input validation, and throttling mechanisms. Detective controls watch for deviations, using logging, monitoring, alerts, and audits to reveal when something threatens or damages one of the principles. Corrective controls then step in to restore the desired state, whether that means revoking compromised credentials, rolling back to a known good configuration, or failing over to a standby environment. When you can describe how each principle is backed by all three types of controls, your understanding of control coverage becomes much more comprehensive. In practice, you often work with scenarios where you must balance trade-offs among these principles under real resource constraints. A design change that dramatically strengthens confidentiality through heavier encryption might impose a performance cost that threatens availability, especially on limited hardware or bandwidth. A strict integrity check that rejects any ambiguity could slow operations to the point where users seek unsafe workarounds, damaging both availability and confidentiality in indirect ways. A resiliency enhancement that adds redundancy and failover paths might introduce greater configuration complexity, which itself becomes a source of integrity and availability failure if not managed carefully. The skill is to articulate these trade-offs explicitly, make informed decisions based on risk and business need, and document the rationale in a way that stands up to later review. Anti-patterns often emerge when single controls are allowed to masquerade as complete solutions for one or more principles. An organization might treat encryption as if it alone guarantees confidentiality, ignoring key management weaknesses or excessive sharing of decrypted data in downstream systems. A robust backup process might be mistaken for full resiliency, even though restorations are rarely tested, and the dependencies needed to use those backups in a crisis are poorly understood. Logging can be overvalued as an integrity safeguard when nobody regularly reviews or correlates the entries, which means tampering or misuse can still pass unseen. Recognizing these anti-patterns helps you ask better questions and avoid overconfidence in isolated controls. To prevent these gaps, it is helpful to build simple guardrail statements that map each principle to design decisions in plain language. A guardrail for confidentiality might say that any new feature exposing customer data must explicitly define who can see what, through which interfaces, and under which conditions. For integrity, a guardrail could require that any change to critical business rules includes a way to verify that those rules were applied correctly, supported by evidence in logs or reports. Availability guardrails might insist that new dependencies are identified, resilience paths documented, and maintenance strategies agreed before going live. Resiliency guardrails can ask that failure modes be described and tested in limited form, so that the first real incident is not also the first experiment in recovery. From these guardrails, you can derive quick checks that validate how well the principles are being honored during reviews and stand-ups. A few focused questions, asked consistently, can reveal whether a team has considered confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resiliency in their design. You might ask how unauthorized access is prevented, how correctness is verified, how the system behaves under load or partial outage, and what evidence will show that these claims remain true over time. These checks do not replace deep assessments, but they serve as an early warning system, catching oversights while changes are still easy to adjust. Over time, they become part of the shared language that keeps security principles active in everyday conversations. Short, minute-long recaps are another practical way to ensure these principles stay ready for use, especially as you prepare for the exam. In 1 minute, you can define confidentiality, give a concrete example from your environment, and name one control that supports it. The same can be done for integrity, availability, and resiliency, rotating through them until the definitions and examples flow naturally without effort. These micro recaps are simple enough to fit between meetings or during a brief walk, yet they strengthen your ability to retrieve clean, precise explanations under time pressure. When exam questions reference these principles in complex scenarios, those practiced recaps help you orient quickly and choose actions that match the underlying goal. As you step back for a mini review, it is useful to notice how the definitions, scenarios, guardrails, quick checks, and common pitfalls combine into a practical mental toolkit. You now have language to describe each principle clearly. Examples of how they apply to everyday events like authentication and data flows, and strategies for balancing them when constraints introduce tension. You also have a way to spot false confidence in single controls and to bring discussion back to the broader pattern of safeguards that each principle really requires. In this light, CIA and resiliency stop being a memorized phrase and become a working framework you can apply repeatedly. The conclusion for Episode 4 brings the focus back to action. Adopt principle checklists that translate these ideas into repeatable habits, and commit to one concrete next step. That next action is to write 3 guardrails that fit your current environment, each anchored in one or more of confidentiality, integrity, availability, and resiliency. With those guardrails written and shared, you begin to reshape the conversations around design, change, and incident review in your daily work. As you refine them over time and revisit them while studying, the principles move even deeper into your reflexes, serving both your exam performance and your professional practice. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.